So I've hinted at some of the causes, so I may repeat myself a little bit here, but in the world of psychology, we think of psychological causes. How do you think about the world around you, your thinking patterns? Are you typically all or nothing thinkers, black and white thinkers, are more prone to depression? We'll maybe come back to that. Socially, it may be you're struggling with relationship problems, friendships, losses, marriage, kids. Also, you may be struggling with the question of meaning in your life. So there are a lot of possible causes. Then we come to the biological, and this may be about brain chemistry. Some people genetically more vulnerable than others. We'll come back to these. This is just a little... Now, from a biblical perspective, we talk about the world, the flesh, and the devil. And they don't parallel exactly the psychological, social, and biological, but there are some similarities. So we talk about the world, and here we're meaning a fallen world, not just the created world, but a fallen world where things happen to you through no fault of your own. You may be involved in an accident and you lose a limb, or you're paralyzed from the neck down, or you have cancer. You didn't choose that. But it's a form of suffering that may cause you to get depressed. You live in a sinful world where you're the victim of other people's sins, of injustice in the government, of persecution in your country, of enemies when you're at war who burn your home down or put bombs in the streets, or people who abuse you when you were a child, sexually, physically, emotionally. And then you are also subject to the effects of your own sin and your own reactions to other people's sin. Then the biblical world, the flesh, sarx in the New Testament, has to be understood in terms of the context, doesn't it? Certainly in the English language, it can be seen as your sinful nature, so your selfishness, your pride, your desire to be in control, your fear, your lack of trust, your dependence on idols in your life. All of these things can contribute to depression. And then the other part of the flesh is our fallen body. So this is back to the biological, the brain chemistry, the hormones, women being more vulnerable around the time of childbirth would be an example of that. And then the devil, and we're all involved all day, every day in spiritual warfare. Now, of course, we don't think of it very much, but it's there all the time. And wherever you are weak in terms of lust, sexual lust maybe, or of temptation to bitterness or covetousness, the devil will be right there beside you with his fiery darts and flaming arrows. So he gets footholds where we are weak, and he's out to destroy the church. So this is a sort of invisible world that we need to be aware of and pray against. So back to the psychological categories, some people are just emotionally more sensitive. They have a harder time regulating their ups and downs of their emotions. And all of us, because our thinking patterns are partly temperamental but partly shaped by the family you grew up in. So if you grew up in a crazy alcoholic family, you will have a tendency to think in all or nothing terms, and you will also have a hard time naming your emotions because you're feeling such a confusion of emotions, and you don't have a parent who's there with you helping you to understand the mess of emotions that's inside you, helping you to name them. Because your parent is always angry or absent. So these tendencies of worry and pessimism, repressed anger, self-centeredness, pride, and so on, are partly a result of the ways we have been sinned against and partly what we have chosen ourselves. And then we may be vulnerable, as I've said, you know, if your parents got divorced when you were young or one of them died, if you were abused, neglected, if you've lived a life where there's just chronic stress all around you, or experiencing trauma in one way or another of abuse or rape or domestic violence, all of these things make us more vulnerable to depression. And losing, you know, as I mentioned with grief, we may lose not just a person, but house, dreams that we may have of a great career, a sense of meaning. All of this contributes to depression. There's a study that was done a few years ago in the United States called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And they asked people questions, 17,000 people, so it's a lot of people, and they asked them in the context of a general health and life review, have you ever experienced, and they put it in more clearer words than I'm putting it here, I'm just summarizing, have you experienced emotional, physical, or sexual abuse? Were your parents alcoholics, one or other? Did your parents divorce? And they found that there was a very strong correlation with the number of these adverse experiences with the later vulnerability to depression and anxiety. So the higher your score of the number of these events, the more likely you were to have to experience. And here it is in relation to suicide attempts. So if you have more than 4 of these adverse experiences in childhood, you can see you have a much higher risk here of suicide. So what often happens is that there's this background of stress, trauma, maybe childhood negative experiences, and then an accumulation of stressful events before the onset of depression. Now, in my own situation, I came from a very secure and loving, good Christian home, and I didn't have a whole lot of negative, stressful events. But in my work and in my family life, with the loss of my sister-in-law, my wife got cancer, thankfully recovered from that. My brother-in-law committed suicide. My father died. We had major stress at work and in the church. This all happened over 2 years, and it just tipped me over the edge. I couldn't cope with all of that. I'd never dealt with failure before, and I didn't know how to deal with it very well. I didn't deal with it very well. So now on then to the biological, the mood disorder genetics. We find that there is, if you experience an episode of severe clinical depression and you have an identical twin, that twin will have a 50% chance of developing depression as well. With bipolar, the manic depression type, the percentage is higher. If one has that form of depression, then there's a 70% likelihood if you have of an identical twin having it. Now these are complex studies, and that's a fairly broad picture of it. And just to say that I think there is a genetic vulnerability that some people have. So we always ask about family history when we are talking to people about depression, and ask, you know, is there a member of your family who has suffered from serious depression or from bipolar disorder or something like that? So how we see the world is really important. And what is it that shapes how we see the world? Two people experiencing similar events may have very different reactions. One person may be very resilient, and another person may succumb to depression or anxiety more easily. So it's not so much what happens to us, but how we view what happened. That is important, isn't it? So how is our view affected? And I think it's affected partly by our genes, our brain structure, our temperament. So if you are, in Winnie the Pooh terms, an Eeyore who is always glum and always negative and always pessimistic, you're likely to be more vulnerable to depression. If you are a piglet where you bounce around and surprise everyone, sorry, not piglet, Tigger. Tigger jumped around, surprising everyone, but he was more of a manic sort of character. Maybe he had bipolar, but you never see him depressed. But some people, and we'll say a little bit more about brain structure and chemistry in a moment here, and then some people also, but out of their life experience, their relationship and their events, coming from a secure, solid, loving home gives you a level of resilience that someone coming from a place where they've had lots of negative life events, they may not have the same resilience. But it's interesting, some people come through a lot of negative life events actually stronger because of those life events. So it's not you can't always predict exactly which way it's going to go. So what affects maturity and resilience? What creates that? And then, of course, one's relationship with God, and whether you have a deep relationship and a sense, an understanding of living in a fallen world, that life is going to be difficult. And Christians are prone to difficulties. God's not going to protect you from all of those. And we have to learn how to go through those with God, much as David did in the Psalms. So when we look at brain scans, and nowadays we can actually sort of see into the brain with MRI scans and CAT scans and so on, all the different forms, you can see which part of the brain is active when people are anxious or depressed or angry or whatever it is. And you can see here in these sort of dramatic, colorful scans, there's quite a difference between this healthy scan and the chronic depression one. And another one here. Certain parts of the brain are the lighting up here, and the more even, balanced aspects of the brain is more an indication of health. But when you look at these, it's interesting to find that you find high activity in the emotion-related parts of the brain, what we call the deep limbic system. And that is correlated with when people are depressed, they tend to be more emotionally sensitive, especially to negative events. So high activity in the emotional-related parts of the brain and decreased activity in the cognition-related parts of the brain. And people often experience difficulty thinking, cognitive impairment. They find it hard to make decisions, hard to focus, hard to concentrate. And then there is also increased activity in the areas associated with guilt and rumination. And people in depression are often ruminating excessively about their sins. I had one client some years ago who was a doctor who had just retired, and interestingly he'd had a stroke, and about somewhere between 25 and 50% of people who have strokes will go into quite serious depression. Partly, I think, because the brain is affected, partly because it makes them depressed to think, I can no longer do the things that I did. But he became obsessed with a patient that he had treated 35 years earlier, who he felt he had let down and not treated very well. When he was not depressed, he didn't think about that patient at all. So it was almost like this was a rumination path in his brain that lit up when he became depressed. Now we think of the brain, the typical way here is to think of to understand it that the nerve is conducting this impulse from one neuron to the next, and it is carried, and there are billions of neurons in the brain, and at that transmission, that junction here, neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and so on are released to carry the message across the gap. And in depression, what we have understood for many years is that there's not enough neurotransmitter. So antidepressants work to increase the amount of neurotransmitter to carry that message across the gap. And antidepressants, we may have time to see later, are actually effective in severe depression. Now, antidepressants also have another function that we've understood more recently. They encourage the growth of new neurons, and they encourage the activity and the connections of the neurons. Now, it's interesting that antidepressants do that, so does exercise. Especially, it's been discovered in rats, but more and more we find, and I certainly find, that exercise is the number one sort of self-help method for helping with depressive tendencies. It increases the oxygen supply to the brain, but it also helps the activity of the neurons, as does an enriched environment for rats and probably for humans. So with antidepressants, about 1 in 3 people improve significantly within 12 weeks when taking an antidepressant if they are severely depressed. So they have the signs that I mentioned earlier on. Milder depression, or moderate depression, however you like to define it, that does not respond as well to, well, it doesn't, most of the research on this shows that placebos, so an inactive medication, works as well as an antidepressant. But I have a number of friends who have used antidepressants who have been moderately depressed, and I could swear just watching them that there was a noticeable improvement. Now, it may have just been due to placebo effect. You know, they thought they were taking an active drug, well, at least the drug, yeah, but the drug wasn't actually doing anything very significant, but they were getting better anyway. But the long and the short of this is that I think that antidepressants are helpful in our current state of knowledge, particularly with severe depression. I say this here, they're most useful in severe depression, and if you combine them with counseling and psychotherapy, then and the talking treatments, that is the most effective of all. But there's a higher relapse rate if you just use them alone. Now, antidepressants have to be used carefully because there are side effects, and you have to sort of juggle to find the right one that is the most effective at the right dose. And you have to stay on them for anything from 6 months to 18 months to sometimes for life, especially if you have bipolar disorder. And we use different medications for bipolar disorder from the regular antidepressants. It's an important distinction. So they need to be taken for quite a long time. And then when you come off them, you need to be weaned off slowly, because when you come off, sometimes you can get rather alarming physical symptoms without that.